Welcome to the Project Precocious podcast, where we explore people making an impact in the worlds of business and philanthropy. I am Dan New, your host and one of the founders at Project Precocious. In our third episode, we get to know Pete Stavros, the co-head of global private equity at KKR, a firm with nearly $600 billion of assets under management. After graduating from Duke, where he was the first person in his family to go to college and studied chemistry, Pete spent several years as a healthcare investor at GTCR. He later got an MBA at Harvard Business School and joined KKR, where he has been for nearly 20 years. While at KKR, Pete has led the industrials team, co-head America's private equity, and is now a member of several investment and management committees at the firm. As co-head of global private equity, Pete oversees KKR's Europe, Asia, and America's private equity investing businesses. Aside from his professional accomplishments, Pete is a philanthropist who founded Ownership Works in 2021. The nonprofit is leading a movement to establish employee ownership programs at businesses. This broad-based employee ownership approach has been proven to create meaningful wealth-building opportunities for employees, which reinvigorates corporate cultures and has led to improved business performance. Ownership Works has partnered with 80-plus organizations, from investors like Apollo, Warburg Pincus, and TPG, and also financial services companies like Goldman, Citi, and JP Morgan. Enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Pete, where he covers the complexities of being an industrials investor, the origin story of Ownership Works, and much, much more. So without further ado, Pete, let's start off with your early days. Growing up, did you face any adversity that shaped you?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Honored to be here and have the opportunity to speak with your audience. The honest answer is not really. I had a great childhood. I had great parents, great family, grew up in just a wonderful environment. So I got very lucky. I also benefited from being a first generation college applicant. So benefited from a pretty significant preference for kids whose folks did not go to college. And then along the way, got some scholarships and some student loans and was able to go to a good undergraduate school and good business school. And so I'm embarrassed to say I've been very fortunate. I can't say I really had any major adversity along the way.
So moving on to your professional life, you joined KKR nearly 2 decades ago after working at another private equity firm where you focused on healthcare. When you joined KKR, you started focusing on industrials and joined that team. So what motivated the transition from healthcare to industrials, and how did your time covering industrials influence the way that you co-lead global private equity today at KKR?
Well, I didn't necessarily have a proactive decision or effort to go from healthcare to industrials. It was very opportunistic. I was a healthcare investor at GTCR. This is going back now, 20 years. And then when I joined KKR, I loved healthcare, wanted to remain a healthcare investor, but there was another gentleman who was at basically the same level as me, and we didn't need both of us doing healthcare. And so opportunities came up over the years. For a period of time, I was a consumer investor. I helped the firm look at starting a real estate business. And then my predecessor who ran industrials retired, and that opened up an opportunity to run the industrials group maybe in 2009. So really it was opportunistic. And the culture of KKR is, you do what's good for the firm. So when they ask you to do something, you do it, whether that's helping them look at starting a real estate business or moving your family. My co-head of global PE moved his family to Asia for a period of years to help us start our Asia business. He moved from being a technology investor to running our consumer team. So that's very much the culture. So when the opportunity came up to run industrials and they asked me to do it, it was both good for the firm and a great opportunity for me. So I was delighted to do it. And then your second question on how has it influenced my approach to my current role, I would say industrials is a pretty difficult space. There's not a lot of secular growth. It's pretty cyclical. A lot of the businesses are capital intensive. You got tough global competition, particularly coming from Asia. And so you really have to grind out returns in the industrial sector. And you've got to be pretty operationally sophisticated, I would say, to be a great investor in industrials. And I think that's helped me look at some industries that I would say are prettier on the surface, like a software type industry or business or back to healthcare. the ability to apply operational skill sets in some of those other sectors can give you a big lift. So I think I've played a role in helping to get our partners who are running some of these other verticals to think maybe a little bit more through an operational value creation lens. Because in industrials, you've got to have it. It's not like you can just ride a big growth wave in the industrial sector.
Well, it seems like that value creation prowess that you've developed has paid off. You've been involved in countless investments, but a few notable ones are CHI Overhead Doors, which manufactures garage doors and was acquired for $685 million. And then Capital Safety, which is a provider of fall protection equipment that was acquired for over $1 billion. So, could you talk about which lessons were most pronounced to you in determining the right companies to invest in and what your value creation levers tend to be?
Well, in industrials, one of the things that we observed was, so if you go back in time, we were active in the industrial sector in the 70s and 80s, and then really got focused on other industries. We built a technology and a software business and got bigger into healthcare and media, financial institutions, and really had not done much of anything in industrials all the way up until around 2010. And so when we got back into it, when they asked me to try and restart our industrials practice, because we had not really made an investment in probably 15 years, it started with what areas do we want to focus on? So I would say initially the emphasis was on thematics. What themes are in the industrial sector that we think are interesting? And that thematic type investing approach, I think it's probably more effective in other verticals. And industrials. It's not that many themes that are like all that exciting. And the ones that are tend to be hard to invest in. You take commercial aerospace, there's so much strategic competition. For assets, it can be hard to invest behind some of these themes. So we then looked and said, well, in the industrials world, who's created a lot of value? And when you look at companies like Danaher and Fortive and the old Roper, which is now pivoted a lot more to being a software business, but there were industrial companies that had found ways to create value. And when you dug into those, you found they had an operational toolkit and a system that they developed, which was repeatable. And kind of no matter the business, they found way to get productivity up, growth up, become more innovative, drive some margin improvement potential. And so we basically started studying all these role model companies and really came to understand their operating system. I personally spent a ton of time studying Toyota and getting very steeped in the Toyota production system. I read tons of books. I used to go to Japan and visit with some of the greats who built the Toyota production system. I worked with them here back in the States doing Kaizen events, started working in our factories hand in hand with some of our great operators to understand how they were creating value, and then developed this big menu, which not surprisingly extends all the way from raw material as you source, all the way to the other end of the value chain to how you sell your product, and got, I'd say, sophisticated enough over a period of years to start asking the right questions to identify and assess operational improvement potential. So that was, I think, the industrial lens. And then that was reinforced by the culture here at the investment committee, which I'd say George Roberts is really the driver of. His question is always, where's the romance in the deal? Why is this company worth more in our hands? What are we going to do with it? He's got other questions as well, but you better come to investment committee prepared to answer that one because you're going to get it every time. And if we don't have insight that will allow us to have a different forecast than what is in the management presentation and what we think other bidders are looking at, we're not going to even proceed. So we've got to have some unique insights on how we're going to create value. A big chunk of that is operational. And I'd say that's where this came from. It came both from studying some of the greats like Toyota and Danaher and others, and then just the culture that George instilled in the investment committee a long time ago and continues to this day of, George, really need to understand what we're going to do with this, why this should be in KKR's hands. So that's pretty deeply embedded in all of our minds at this point.
So, when it comes to a competitive industry like private equity, how do you advise someone differentiates themselves to eventually become a partner or co-head or something of that sort?
I would think about your career like you would think about a business. When you're looking at a business to invest in, you want something that's got competitive barriers. It's hard to do what they do. There's a reason that this company is sought out for whatever they do. Think about your career the same way. How can you build barriers to entry for your own career? Your table stakes in our industry is industry and competitive analysis and due diligence and knowing how to do financings and accounting, tax structuring work, purchase and sale agreements and legal documentations, management equity plans, et cetera. But then from there, it's like, what's going to be special about your skill set that's going to make it hard to be as good of an investor as you're going to be? And there's lots of ways to do that. For some people, they're just so steeped in the industry from a relationship standpoint. They know all the CEOs, they know all the best companies, they know all the divisional leaders at those companies, and they're going to have an unparalleled network. For me, it was operations, as I mentioned. So if you have an orientation towards that and you find it genuinely interesting, the Japanese saying is go to Gemba. You got to go to where value is created and really understand it, meaning working in factories and riding with truck drivers and salespeople. And that over years is going to allow you to identify and quantify operational value creation. So, but doesn't need to be, you can be a thematic investor in software. I think there are people who've picked the right areas for vertical software that have made a lot of money and haven't really had to be experts in operations. They just really understood the themes and picked the right spots. There's lots of ways you could do it, but I would just think about your personal differentiation as an investor. How are you going to be doing something unique that just everybody else can't easily do?
So far, we've spoken about the history of private equity quite a bit. I'd like to switch gears now to focus on the future of private equity. Let's say you and I get together and call it 5 years. We're grabbing some coffee. What element of private equity as an industry do you expect will have changed by then? And what do you think the catalyst for that change will have been?
Well, I expect in 5 years, there'll be a lot more retail participation in private equity. And that's driven by people having a great demand for alternatives and illiquid private investments and some new offerings that allow people to participate in funds in smaller quantums. We're certainly doing that. Blackstone's doing that. There's others who will be pursuing that. I expect Asia private equity will continue to grow, and the driver there will just be a deepening of the capital markets and the institutionalization of private equity in Asia. And I think private equity globally will continue to grow. And the catalyst there is it's a better way to invest. If you think about public versus privates, privates allow you to construct your own portfolio and choose your management team, drive operational value creation, create bespoke incentive plans. There's just so much that we can do relative to the public markets. And so I think PE globally is going to continue to grow. I think there's still a long way to go, even in the US. And then lastly, I would say my hope is that 5 years from now, we see the industry really making progress on issues around labor, and that there's an opportunity for private equity to be a catalyst for wealth creation for workers and for building better corporate cultures.
Well, speaking of that final piece, that labor piece, let's switch gears to ownership works. When it comes to life, there are so many competing interests. You've got your friends, your family, your career. How have you been able to actually weave in starting a philanthropic organization and also remained a prominent investor?
Well, I had a lot of support from the firm and from my partners and from the nonprofit community who helped us get funded. Ownership Works is adjacent to what I do every day. So honestly, it's been a lot easier. You mentioned David Kim. You look at David starting something that is not so adjacent to his day job. Honestly, that's probably a much bigger lift. I'm basically taking something that I know works in my day job. I and many others would like to see become more common, which is sharing ownership with workers. I had support from the firm to help really spread this practice and share some of our insights from having tried this for the better part of 15 years now. And we had a lot of great support from labor leaders to nonprofit foundations to other investors, Wall Street banks. And I'd say the last thing, what's enabled me to do it is I was fortunate to hire a great team at Ownership Works run by a really brilliant woman. So I don't have to do that much anymore. She's really driving it.
So, for those listeners of the Project Precocious podcast who have jobs outside of finance, could you describe to them what an employee ownership program is and how that works related to a private equity transaction?
Sure. So CEOs and very senior executives get given stock as a part of their employment, and they get given that stock because it's retentive. It will encourage them to stay at the company because it vests over time, and it'll be motivating. It'll allow them the chance to build real wealth, and it aligns them with shareholders. So all those same ideas apply to workers as well. And we want workers to not want to quit and to be more motivated. And when it's combined with these other elements of this broader program we've developed around financial education, personal financial literacy training, providing more information to workers so they understand the business plan and where we're headed and how we're doing, giving workers more voice, more control over their daily work, delegating some decision-making rights to the frontline workforce. When you do all of that, you can really change the culture of a business. So for workers, they feel more engaged on the job, less likely to quit. And for companies, they get stronger cultures. I was just looking at some data from a manufacturing company where we just rolled out an ownership program 6 months ago, and it was probably the best roll I've ever done. And in our main manufacturing plant, the turnover dropped almost 50 percentile points. So in other words, when we bought it in this main plant, 65% of the workforce was quitting every year, which sounds crazy. It's not that unusual, which gets into the way our economy is running is berserk and doesn't make any sense. And 6 months later, that 65% is now about 16%. So just think about the benefits there, not only to workers who feel more engaged, feel like they've got a stake in the outcome and a reason to stay, but for the company that's not recruiting all these folks every year, having to onboard them, retrain them, and then not losing all of their knowledge and productivity and all the benefits to quality and customer satisfaction. There's massive potential for both workers and companies alike. And if you kind of abstract to the broader economy, any economist will tell you the key to prosperity is productivity growth. It's the only way to get wage growth without inflation. And how can we have real productivity growth if the average company out there is churning their workforce 30, 40, 50% a year? Retailers churn their workforce 100% a year. And you look at Gallup surveys, 70% of Americans don't like their jobs, and 20% hate their employer. They're throwing the proverbial wrenches in the machines, trying to hurt the company that they work for. So how can we have real productivity growth? If you've got people bouncing from job to job, they hate their employer, it's just not possible. So whether you're looking at the level of the individual worker, the individual company, or you abstract to the broader economy, there's like all sorts of reasons why broadening ownership inside of corporate America makes sense.
You touched upon this concept of the more senior individuals of a business typically getting some stake of equity in the business that they run. Could you describe how you came up with this vision that ownership was something that all employees deserve across an organization? And then furthermore, how you actually tested it and refined that concept to launch Ownership Works in February of 2021.
Well, the story of the inspiration is a long one. I don't want to bore your listeners. And there wasn't some moment where it was like, I got it. This is what we should do. It started with my upbringing and my dad being a construction worker working for a union. He was one of these prototypical hourly workers, hated his job, hated the company he worked for, lots of strikes and labor unrest. And my dad always dreamt of some way of aligning the union and the workers with the company. He talked about ownership or profit sharing or some way of doing it. And that unfortunately never happened, but that certainly stuck with me. I then worked on an ESOP at one point in the 1990s. An ESOP is a tax incentive where Congress 50 years ago decided companies would get a tax break for sharing stock ownership with workers. It's become a lot less common now, but that really fascinated me. When I went to business school, I studied that in great depth. And then when I got into a leadership position, which I mentioned was around 2009 in industrials, the first time I'd ever run an industry vertical, just decided to try it. We had a company that the workers weren't terribly happy, lots of people quitting their jobs. Engagement had never been measured, but when it was measured, was very low. There were safety issues in the manufacturing plants. And so that was a test case. And then we tried it another 5 times in industrials. And then when we had some success, we tried it in other industry verticals. And now we're trying it in other regions of the world. And Ownership Works came about because when we started to talk about our experience with broadening ownership, and we didn't start talking about that till maybe 7 or 8 years after we started it, because we wanted to get comfort that this was actually going to have impact for both workers and companies alike. And when we started talking about it, then I got a flood of inbounds from other investors, public companies, family-owned businesses, asking a lot of questions about, hey, how could we do this? Could you help us? And obviously, I had a day job, needed more help. That was part of the impetus for starting this nonprofit. But we also spoke internally about, God, imagine if we could really get this ball rolling and having lots of investment firms doing this, helping other public companies do it, we could impact a lot of people. Because private equity, although imperfect, is a pretty great governance model. It's very efficient. We own hundreds of companies. And if I convince the management committee of the firm that something makes sense, like broad-based ownership, we can cascade that across many, many companies and literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of workers. So that was the other exciting part of Ownership Works, is if we could get a coalition of 20, 30, 40 private equity firms, many of whom individually are responsible for hundreds of thousands of workers, you could impact millions of people. And so that was kind of the formation of Ownership Works. I needed more help to answer questions and help people who wanted to do this. We needed a neutral third party to be a warehouse for best practices and to do convenings and to get CEOs from different companies together to workshop this. And then we wanted to build a movement and try and impact not just our own portfolio, but millions of people around the world. And so we all thought, hey, it's worth a shot. And so we've been at it for a couple of years now, and we've got almost 100 organizations, 30 or 40 private equity firms, some public companies, some family businesses, and have done a lot of work in building a huge content library that helps CEOs think through how to do this. How to communicate ownership plans, how to train people on some basic finance concepts, how to use ownership to then build a different type of culture where workers have more voice, feel more engaged on the job. And so that's what is at Ownership Works today. We're at One Penn Plaza. As I said, it's run by a really brilliant woman named Annalisa Miller. We've got about 30 employees, and we're growing pretty fast.
I love this idea of employee ownership being a movement. So could you bring us into the boardroom when you're pitching Ownership Works to a private equity firm and saying, hey, this is the idea, what do you think? And on top of that, I'd be curious about what the common points of resistance are related to that pitch.
Well, before I get to the resistance points, I would say the appeal is this is truly an opportunity to have a win-win, which almost never exists. Almost always there are clear trade-offs. You're going to do something for the climate. Well, guess what? Those investments tend not to have great returns. We should still do them. But this is unique, where we can invest in people, we can have better cultures, and we can have people less likely to quit, more engaged on the job, which then allows us to execute on operational improvement at these companies. So I think the appeal is we could help a lot of people, we could make for stronger companies, and we've got an opportunity to help folks build wealth who normally would never have a chance to do something like that. The points of resistance are, gosh, will workers really ever understand ownership? Many will have not owned stock before. Many will have not owned any assets before. Many don't have an interest in finance. So we're starting maybe from ground zero. Don't workers just want cash? Do they even really want stock? Sometimes you hear people say, oh, it's just really the people at the top who make the brilliant decisions, pull a few levers, and that's where all the value is really created. And so shouldn't we just load up the people at the top who really move the needle? So those are some of the points of resistance. And I think our belief is our job's to drive operational improvement and to maximize how well run these businesses are. And if you've got a company where the workforce is turning over, like I said, 30, 40, 50%, sometimes much higher, and you're rehiring the workforce every 2 to 3 years, and if it's like an average American company, 70% of people don't like their jobs and 20% hate the company they work for, can you possibly say with a straight face, you're doing everything you could to maximize the value of the business with that kind of a culture? And so how can you claim to be a hands-on, operationally intensive investor without doing something about that? And ownership, when combined with these other efforts around education and training, information sharing, delegating decision-making, et cetera, that can massively move the needle on how workers feel about the company that they work for, how they feel about themselves, their role in the business. And all that leads to, like I said, a stronger culture and a better business. Now, the biggest issue I would say that I glossed over, didn't mention in terms of pushback is, as I often say, CEOs are overwhelmed. So CEOs are already tasked with, hey, you got to improve your earnings and your margins and your growth. And we want you to improve diversity of the board, of the C-suite. We want you to improve diversity deep in the organization. So change the way you're recruiting, where you're recruiting from. We want you to decarbonize. We want you to reduce water consumption, landfill tonnage, electricity utilization. We want you to harden the business against a cyber attack. The list is so long. And then we're adding on top of it, we want you to make everyone an owner, make sure they understand it, teach financial literacy, drive employee engagement. And it's just like, oh my God, how can we possibly do all this? And so the key is helping people understand that if they do these last things well around people and human capital, then all the other things become easier. But that is also, I'd say, a key area of pushback is CEOs are overwhelmed with priorities.
So our last guest was David Kim, who you know. He's the founder of Children Fallen Patriots and is a fellow private equity investor. And I was speaking to him, and he actually had a great question that I'm hoping to raise to you. His question is, employee ownership makes sense, align the long-term interests of a company with the employees. However, some employees place much greater value on cash bonuses over long-term equity plan participation, despite obviously the long-term equity plans offering larger upside. So, how do you get the right balance to have the stock awards produce the intended effects versus paying cash to those employees who just don't understand stock ownership and are disinterested in it?
Yeah, this is hard. And this is, as I mentioned, a common question of, don't people just want cash? And we have to start from a place of the cash needs to be market competitive. This is not about trade-offs. So we need to start from a place of workers are getting a market competitive level of wages and benefits. And then this needs to be free to workers and incremental. So we're not asking workers to invest out of pocket. We're not asking them to trade off wages or benefits. This can't be about shifting risk onto the workforce. Now, you could say, okay, got it. Well, the workers will start from that place. It's market competitive, fair wages and benefits. But in terms of what we add on from here, why don't we just add on more cash as opposed to stock? And if you think about it from first the company's standpoint, adding more cash is a hit to earnings. Depending on how you do it, it could be more fixed costs. So it could actually increase the volatility of the earnings and lower the value of the business. More cash really doesn't do that much to align long-term interests. It's not long-term retentive. And from the worker standpoint, they just can't build wealth on cash. Open up your Excel and look at a 20-year model of a worker earning $20 an hour and play around with that wage level, double the wages, and then compare that with if they could get some ownership and if the company performs. There's nothing like that tax deferred compounding of equity value to build wealth. It's just really not possible. People need to own to build real wealth. And if you look at the data on household wealth from the Federal Reserve, you can see clear as day that the thing driving wealth inequality is stock ownership. It's not home ownership. It's the fact that wealthy people own a lot of stock and everyone else doesn't.
So the last segment we have here is a quick fire round, and it's intended to be a bit more fun, easy, and the answer should be about 30 seconds or so. So the first question is, what's your favorite way to unwind?
Oh gosh, watching TV with my wife and eating Ben and Jerry's ice cream or something, or just hanging out with our kids. Nothing exciting, sadly.
Nothing wrong with that. So you live in New York City. What's your favorite restaurant there, and what dish do you recommend?
I really love Union Square Cafe. It's been around forever. It's in our neighborhood. We live in the village and it's moved, but it's been around for a very long time. I always get their bib salad and whatever fish they're serving.
When it comes to self-improvement, all of us are working on something. What skill are you currently working on, and how are you actually targeting that skill to improve it?
I tend to be impatient, so I'm trying to become more patient. For me, it's highly correlated with diet and exercise. So coffee makes me very impatient. And if I'm not exercising, I get more impatient. So I'm just I'm a more like even keeled person if I'm eating well, not drinking coffee and exercising. So I'm working on that. Meditation makes a big difference for me. So I'm at a point in my life, I just have so much on my mind between our kids who are very busy right now and staying close with my wife, my work, the nonprofit work. There's some policy work I'm doing in DC. That's a whole separate effort. I'm trying to help some friends start a different nonprofit. I just feel like I have so much going on. And if I don't meditate, I kind of lose things. So that I'm working on being more consistent with meditation. And I'm trying to spend more of my time and mental energy thinking about how I can help other people. And honestly, it's very selfish. Like you're just happier if you're helping other people. It's exhausting to be thinking about yourself all the time. So I'm from the moment I wake up through the end of my day, just trying to think about what can I do and leverage this amazing platform I've been entrusted with by Henry and George and Joe and Scott to help other people.
Confident on the last point of helping other people that you've done so today through your wisdom. The last question I have is, we have a large audience, some of which may be interested in supporting Ownership Works. How can they do so?
Well, I appreciate you asking. I would say visit the website, learn more about it. There's a mailbox there. You could send even just a note of support. Of course, we take contributions. It's a nonprofit. Talking to people about the idea of broad-based ownership. I've done a lot of polling work on employee ownership. About 3 in 100 Americans know what it is as an idea. So I think just even talking, particularly if there are people in business or in investing or have some way of influencing how ownership is distributed in corporate America, just talking about it as an idea in the boardroom, at investment committees, with other people in the business world, I think could only help.
Well, Pete, it was an absolute privilege getting to know you over this interview. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us for the third episode of the Project Precocious podcast. Be sure to learn more about Ownership Works at their website and through their LinkedIn page. Special thanks to my two partners at Project Precocious, Jacob Posada and Grant Gilbert, for their contributions to supporting our portfolio of nonprofits that we partner with. Until next time, stay well.